remember, back to this rare earth minerals deal that apparently was agreed to, at least a framework of it, by the United States and Ukraine. President Trump was asked about this today in the Oval Office. This is what he said about it, because we learn Volodymyr Zelenskyy is coming to Washington, to the White House on Friday. We also learned that the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer coming on Thursday. This as French President Macron was just there yesterday. Let's listen to Trump here.
True that President Zelenskyy is coming on Friday to meet with you, and is the mineral deal sorted out?
Yeah, I hear that. I hear that he's coming on Friday. Certainly, it's okay with me if he'd like to, and he would like to sign it together with me, and I understand that's a big deal, a very big deal. And I think the American people, even if you look at polling, they're very happy because, you know, Biden was throwing money around like it's cotton candy, and it's a very big deal. Look, it could be $1 trillion deal, it could be whatever, but it's rare earths and other things. And look, we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars on Ukraine and Russia fighting a war that should have never, ever happened. That's a war that would have never happened if I were president. And it didn't happen for 4 years. People say, how do we know that it didn't happen for 4 years? Would have never happened. And nevertheless, this guy went into this situation and he spent money like nobody's ever seen, $350 billion. The other thing that we don't like is that Europe has spent $100 billion. We've spent $350 billion. Europe gets their money back because they spent it in the form of a loan, and we just gave them, whether it's 300 or 350 billion, nobody really knows. They can't even tell me the answer to that. It means probably more than that. So what we're doing is now we're saying, look, we want to be secured. We want to get that money back. We're helping a country through a very, very big problem, a problem like very few people have had. Shouldn't have had this problem because it shouldn't have happened, but it did happen, so we have to straighten it out. But the American taxpayer now is going to get their money back plus.
Mr. President, yesterday with Emmanuel Macron, you said you had spoken to Putin about the idea of peacekeepers in Ukraine, that Putin was fine with it. The Kremlin, I guess, has said that that's actually unacceptable to them. What's real here?
That's not what I was told. But you're going to need some form of peacekeeping, so something will be done that's going to be satisfactory to everybody. We need peacekeeping too.
Any situation with American troops involved?
It's actually something I did discuss, but a form of peacekeeping that's acceptable to everybody. Ultimately, we'll be able to agree on something, I'm sure.
With Ukraine and this mineral deal, what does Ukraine get in return, Mr. President?
$350 billion and lots of equipment and military equipment and the right to fight on and originally the right to fight. Look, Ukraine, I will say they're very brave and they're good soldiers, but without the United States and its money and its military equipment, this war would have been over in a very short period of time. In fact, I was the one that gave the javelins. You remember the famous javelins? That was me. That wasn't Obama. It wasn't Biden. It wasn't anybody else. It was me. And they wiped out a lot of tanks with those javelins. And the expression was that Obama gave sheets and I gave the javelins. That was a big deal at the time. It wiped out. That was the beginning when people said, wow, that's something. Well, that was American equipment. Without American equipment, this war would have been over very quickly. And American money, too. I mean, a lot of money.
So Mr. President, that war-fighting equipment and the ammunition, that's sustained going forward for Ukraine, and how long is it sustained?
Well, it could go forward for a while, and maybe until we have a deal with Russia. Look, we need to have a deal with Russia, otherwise it's going to continue. But now when Americans put up their money, the taxpayer money, and the president approves it, we're getting our money back in some form. But it could go on for a while, or it could be settled quickly. I think it's going to be settled quickly. I spoke with President Putin. I think he wants to settle it, and wants to get on with life. It's horrible. What's happening horrible. Thousands of soldiers a week are being killed, and others too, but especially on the battlefield. Thousands a week are being killed, and we want that to end.
Back on live there to the White House. So just some of the thoughts President Trump was explaining there on the contours of the talks going on and the war itself. In the meantime, let's continue talking about that with our colleague and our friend there, national security analyst and expert and retired Marine intelligence officer Hal Kempfer, who joins me. Hal, good to see you. And I want to talk about the parameters of this deal, at least what's being reported here. But this is a change in the philosophy of our relationship. And correct me if I'm wrong, between the United States and Ukraine. At the outset of the war, during the Biden administration, nothing was expected in return from Ukraine for U.S. support. Yes, we wanted them to win. We would have liked a kind of absolute victory, so to speak, over Russia. But as we always say, elections have consequences. And now President Trump is trying to broker this. It seems to have been brokered for Ukraine to recoup costs of the support that we have given them over the last 3 years. That's tangible. A victory in Ukraine so they can restore their democracy and live free. Is that intangible? Should we have asked for all of this all along, or no? Is this a departure?
Well, Andrew, it's a departure in that most of what we provided, pretty much all of what we provided, was in the form of grants. It was, here's your money. And there was no stipulation for payback. No, it wasn't a loan or a loan guarantee or anything like that. It was simply, here's your money. And there was never any expectation. Now, the Trump administration has come back and said, we want to get that repaid. Now, there's a big difference between, what was the amount that the U.S. provided. You heard President Trump talking about $350 billion. If you look at congressional allocations for Ukraine, and that's both military and humanitarian aid, total aid across the board, it's about half of that. It's about $175 billion. I did hear that was an estimate that was out the last time Congress appropriated money for Ukraine. I heard an estimate that the total may have creeped up to about a little over 180, maybe 183, 84 billion. So that's the U.S. contribution that he wants to somehow recoup back to the United States. And he's looking at, and he's not wrong when he talks about what the Europeans did. The Europeans have actually given more money in total across the board, more money in the United States. I think theirs is up to a little over 190 billion. However, about 90% of what the Europeans have given Ukraine is in the form of loans, which means at some point Ukraine is expected to pay that back. So he's not incorrect in saying that the U.S. in the Biden administration did, in fact, give away a lot of money to Ukraine, and the Europeans loaned a lot of money to Ukraine, and there is a different status. So that's correct. The amounts of money, though, wildly different from what's on record as opposed to what President Trump has talked about. I'm not quite sure where he got that. I kind of did some math where I was like, well, if you were to loan that money with a high risk return on investment or something, doing sort of venture capital type stuff, I go, maybe you get it up to about $300 billion if you did that, but that's not built in any calculation, and certainly was nothing ever stated. And that's the closest I could come to wherever that 300 billion plus number came from.
Yeah, I think it's important because I get a lot of questions about this since we do our conversations all the time about this war and what the United States' commitment has been in dollars and cents here. Now, Fox Business correspondent Edward Lawrence has these numbers when it comes to Europe's commitments. When we talk about Europe, it's collectively. It's right. The G7, the EU, other countries not in the EU that want to come to the support of Ukraine. So he says since the start of the war, the EU and our member states have made available close to $145 billion in financial, military, humanitarian, and refugee assistance, of which 65% has been provided as grants or in-kind support, meaning here's a check, here you go, you don't have to pay us back, and 35% in the form of highly concessional loans. So I think that's interesting. It kind of puts into perspective what Europe has put in, also what the United States has put in, those numbers you just cited. I want to go, though, into the deal more because Trump has argued the minerals deal will yield billions of dollars of revenue for the United States. Apparently, this is going to be some kind of joint partnership sharing venture between Ukraine and the United States over the course of the short term and the long term here, though. One source at the Financial Times, this was in their report, said Zelenskyy managed to negotiate a final draft that did not include a key U.S. demand that it would have rights to $500 billion in future revenue. So apparently that number came dramatically lower, and maybe that's why Zelenskyy signed on?
Well, he signed on for a number of reasons. And first off, I should go back, if I may, I'm going to go back to the numbers real quick. There's over $50 billion of congressionally allocated U.S. funds that have not been spent for Ukraine. It's still out there. And I think that Vladimir Zelenskyy wanted to firm that up. Part of the mineral rights agreement, as you heard, kind of keeps the money flowing, keeps the current aid package going. That is not an insubstantial amount of aid. When you talk about, I think it was like $57 billion. When you talk about, Norway gave over $1 billion and the UK allocated $5.5 billion. That sounds substantial, but that's a rounding error, with the 50 billion, if you want to talk about that, that's outstanding with the US. So he wants to keep that intact. He wants to keep all the other aid coming from that intact. And so that's a big part of this, is it keeps that going. The other thing, and keep in mind, the finalized agreement has not been seen. All right, we're just catching bits and pieces. The $500 billion demand that was in the as far as repayment to the U.S. that was in the original offer was not in this agreement. That we've heard time and time again, that is out. And the question I had is, okay, so what does the U.S. get from this? There's kind of some vague language out there right now, and it may get changed, but it's talking about 50% of the proceeds that comes from the rare earths mining, and it also includes things like natural gas and oil and stuff. And that's where it gets a little bit more complicated, and that's why this may not be a bad agreement for Ukraine or Zelenskyy at all. I live in Los Angeles, and there's a famous thing out here called studio accounting. That they get a movie star to make a movie, and they go, oh, you're going to get a huge chunk of the profits from this movie. And they go, great. And they sign the agreement. And then they have the biggest blockbuster of the year. And when it's all said and done, by the time they get done with the accounting, it barely broke even. And they get like a tiny little check. Mining is an interesting business. My father was a miner, and I've done a lot of things looking at mining. I've done consulting in mining. There's a saying in that world, which is, if you want to make a small fortune in mining, you start with a large fortune. First off, you have to mine it. That's part of it. Just getting the raw minerals, all the mining and everything else. And then all the remediation has to be done afterwards. Then you have to process whatever you mined. Then you have to get it to wherever it's got to go. And the question I have on the proceeds is, where do you recognize the proceeds? At what point? Is it when it comes out of the mine? Is it after it's processed? Is it after it gets to the end customer?
I see.
And there's a lot of things to be negotiated here, so it may not be what it is. The other thing, too, is some of those rare earths are actually in Russian-occupied Ukraine, which opens up another issue, which is promising stuff that Ukraine, well, technically doesn't even control right now.
Right.
Then the other one is oil and natural gas. For reasons I won't get into, I've had a lot of reasons to look at the Black Sea.
Okay.
In some of my consulting and looking at, where is the oil and natural gas fields? A lot of them, if you look at the exclusive economic zones, are in the Black Sea under areas which technically are the EEZs of areas that Russia occupies. But Russia doesn't control those areas.
Okay.
And it puts the U.S. in a position of, if we have a stake in getting those proceeds from that, then we have a stake in making sure that those exclusive economic zones stay in Ukrainian hands. So it's a rather interesting agreement.
So Barack Ravid at Axios has some of the language of the draft agreement. It stated the U.S. wants to keep Ukraine, quote, free, sovereign, and secure, but did not mention specific security guarantees. And that's what I'm kind of failing to imagine right now. Is all of the extraction going to be the aegis of Ukraine to do without U.S. involvement? Do we just take a cut of the revenue and the proceeds? And granted, yes, I would imagine that some of the proceeds, some of the revenue is going to go to Ukraine, whatever cut they get, to rebuild their war-torn country. I'm sure this will all be discussed with Zelenskyy on Friday. He's coming to the White House. I'm not entirely sure whether or not this was hastily drawn together of a visit by him, but this is going to be quite highly anticipated to watch the body language, the demeanor, some of the statements coming from President Trump. We've reported on what he has said about Zelenskyy in the past week here and how Zelenskyy responds to it in real time. That is going to be something to watch come Friday. The politics of this, Barack Revita Axios describes the relationship between the U.S. and Ukraine right now as, quote, crumbling. Can they put it back together on Friday, Hal?
I don't know. I don't know. But I will say this: it's coming after, he met with the Poland's head of state. It wasn't a great meeting. He was supposed to have an hour. I think he ended up with 11 minutes. It wasn't really that terrific, but it was kind of an opportunistic meeting. And then, of course, he had that really what looked like a great meeting with Macron of France, and now he's going to have a meeting with Keir Starmer of Great Britain. And so he'll be following a week of those before he has this meeting with Zelenskyy. So the message is pretty consistent all the way up going to that meeting from these other countries as far as what needs to be done. The other thing I would also mention, which is really interesting, was that President Zelenskyy talked about talking to Belgium. And of the $220 billion of the frozen Russian assets that are held in Europe, of the 300+ billion that are held worldwide, Belgium is actually the biggest holder of those frozen Russian assets. And there is big discussion today. Great Britain came out and said, yes, it's time to seize those assets and use them to pay Ukraine. That is happening. I mean, I don't want to mix it too much, but that whole movement is happening very quickly. At the same time, we have this mineral rights agreement.
Right.
And from Ukraine's standpoint, it's all how much money are we going to get from everything? How many security guarantees are we going to be able to get with this? All of this is happening simultaneously, and it's going into Friday. And I don't know what's going to happen between now and Friday in terms of the frozen assets thing. But the U.S., surprisingly, as we've cut back our influence in that, is having less influence in that. And the Europeans are going to probably do whatever they do. And that's going to be playing in the background while they're talking about the agreement and while they're working out the details of the agreement. By the way, I should also mention that when you do mining and you're doing all that stuff, you have overhead. You got security. You got to secure the mines. How much do you allocate as a security cost? Well, we had to hold the Russian army at bay. Okay, so how much of that? Maybe 2 or 3 divisions?
Yeah.
You start getting into some rather interesting stuff that gets into at what point the U.S. would see that 50% of the proceeds. I just mentioned this. I'm not saying that the Ukrainians are sitting there doing studio accounting on this, but they are looking at this. If it's a percentage, that's a big difference from a hard number. And I think the Ukrainians are very well aware of what potentially this could help them do.
Yeah, and I want to just make the comparison. Maybe this is a leap, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but there are somewhat hallmarks and similarities to what President Trump has said about the Gaza Strip and U.S. involvement within the Gaza Strip, because this was a candidate who ran on decreasing and diminishing the U.S. footprint abroad. So he has the Gaza idea still floating out there of U.S. ownership of Gaza. And then this very long-term rare earths mineral mining deal on the table, at least a framework of which is on the table, between the U.S. and Ukraine that we may be tangled in with Ukraine for, 10, 15 years. Mining operations don't just spring up overnight. They take a long, long time to develop, the infrastructure of which takes time to develop here. So I just thought that was somewhat maybe interesting, maybe ironic that, right now there's no U.S. troops on the ground in Ukraine. Obviously, there wouldn't be when you strike a deal like this that's purely financial on its face. But it's still long-term involvement with an ally, yes, on these financial grounds when maybe the war is all said and done. But the war is still ongoing. And so I just think maybe voters of the president might be surprised that he is so eager to jump into something like this. But yes, the rationale for it is recouping some of the costs we've given during the Biden administration. So we'll just have to wait and see. Friday will be interesting. Hal Kempfert, thanks so much.
Okay, thank you, Andrew.